Government fails, the world's off its rails, leaders are whacked, democracy is under attack. It's time to get smart, folks, time to get real. Let's cut through the crap, tell us how you feel. Let's cue the talent, let's meet the host. Podcast by George.
Hello, hi, how are you? Welcome on back into another podcast by George. We got big news today. We got a blockbuster. We got a bombshell, and it's going to be a lot of fun for me because, man, this strikes close to home. This is right where I live, and it's from Laura Belin with Bleeding Heartland. I hope you're following Bleeding Heartland. The news is, I saw it in the newspaper today. I mean, they're covering what she's finding out, and you've seen her on Podcast by George doing a great job out there, and I want to go ahead and bring her on in here and welcome Laura Belin back to a Podcast by George. Hi, Laura.
Oh, thanks so much for having me on again, George.
Well, like I mentioned, this lives right where I'm at. And we talked about this, briefly, I think, when you and I were together before. But, I'm a big critic of this CARES Act thing. I mean, when it came out, a lot of people were just kind of on a wait-and-see basis. But not me. Man, I was opposed to this thing from the very beginning. I looked at this and I said, my God, they just gave away the vault. They just gave $5 trillion to the multinational companies, to the oligarchs, it's the biggest trickle-down scheme since the pharaohs of old Egypt is the way that I put it. And, Laura, I described it to people. I don't think a lot of people we live in our own cocoons, not to be critical, but they don't see what's going on in this country and in the communities that they live as in America now. Here's some statistics. 80% of workers live paycheck to paycheck. Now, this is pre-pandemic. 65% of Americans couldn't afford a $500 emergency. And right now, because they've lost their jobs and they've lost their health care, 50 million Americans don't have health care because of the loss of jobs, and they just can't afford to be in the ACA. They couldn't make the deductible payments if they had to anyway. So basically, they don't have health care. $5 trillion given from the top down in this trickle-down thing. And I cite Lee Camp all the time. He kind of did a little math on this. He says $1 trillion. He said, envision this. Think of a $1,000 bill. They don't even make them anymore. They only make $100 bills. But let's say they make $1,000 bills. A stack of $1,000 bills would go 63 miles high to make $1 trillion. That's the kind of money we're talking about. And so they just gave some crumbs to the American workers. They gave the $600 unemployment, the $1,200 relief check that a lot of people got. And all of this money went to the top. Laura Belin goes to work and tries to figure out where and how this money's being used, this $450,000. Laura, take it from there. Tell us about the latest bombshell this story. Yeah.
Well, I mean, first of all, I'm not philosophically opposed to the idea of the CARES Act. I think a lot of the money has been spent on very important work, and there were a lot of additional expenses incurred due to this pandemic. So, for instance, a lot of workers at the Iowa Department of Human Services were taken off their regular jobs and put on things like contact tracing. And I think that's completely appropriate to spend federal funds on that. I don't have a problem. I think that the issue with the CARES Act is that there isn't enough oversight of how it's spent. And Iowa got about $1.25 billion for a coronavirus relief fund. And then the Republican-controlled legislature just told the governor, basically, you can do whatever you want. So there's almost no legislative oversight of how that money is spent. And Governor Reynolds turned around and spent about 40% of it, about $490 million on the unemployment trust fund, which it doesn't go to unemployed Iowans. It's a fund of money that prevents businesses from seeing their unemployment taxes go up. And a lot of people felt that that wasn't really an appropriate use, especially not for such a large portion of all the funds that we got. But my investigation actually wasn't originally about the CARES Act funding at all. I was looking into another issue that I've been interested in for more than a year now, which is how does Governor Reynolds pay for this bloated staff that she has? She keeps bringing on expensive, high-paid policy advisors, and she got a budget increase she got the Republican legislature to agree to increase her office's budget by 10% in 2019. But then she hired a lot of new people, and I couldn't figure out how they were going to balance the books on this. So late last year, probably around November, December, I submitted a records request under Iowa's open records law for all of the agreements that covered if other agencies were paying for the salaries of people in the governor's office. This is a practice that goes back many years and several administrations. And I've reviewed those kinds of agreements before. And I was really surprised to be told late last year that the governor's office had no documents responsive to my request. And I thought, how is that possible? So it occurred to me, well, maybe they're signing these agreements a little later in the fiscal year. The fiscal year in Iowa runs from July 1st to June 30th of the next year. So I kind of made a mental note, next summer, ask again for these salary sharing agreements. And of course, everything blew up with the pandemic. But in the summer, I circled back and I asked, the Department of Management is the Iowa agency that deals with the actual payments, the disbursements to various agencies all the time, not just during the pandemic. It's like the manager of the state budget. So I requested the salary sharing agreements and I received those in August. And I found that 3 of the governor's staff were indeed entirely paid by other state agencies, which didn't surprise me. I expected they must be offloading some of those expenses. But what was surprising was that these agreements ran through March 13th of 2020. And the fiscal year, of course, ends on June 30th. And I'd never seen that before. I'd reviewed this kind of, it's called a memorandum of understanding, not a contract, but I've reviewed these kinds of agreements before, and I just had never seen one that didn't run through June 30th. And I started thinking, well, March 13th, I wonder if they were using some kind of coronavirus-related money to cover these expenses. So I went back to the Department of Management to say, hey, are these 3 staffers' salaries, what was paying for their salaries after March 14th? And did anyone else in the governor's office have their salaries paid by some other source, either federal funds or some other funding source? And I was shocked in late August to get records back that said that 21 staff in the governor's office had part of their salary paid by the CARES Act, the federal COVID relief fund. So then I had a lot more questions about that, and it took a couple more weeks before I got the specific dollar amounts for each staffer, and that added up to just under $450,000. But that's a pretty big chunk of change. I mean, that's like almost 20% of the entire budget. The governor's office was budgeted to have about $2.3 million for staff and other expenses. And so to add $450,000 on top of that is a lot. And I couldn't get the governor's office to answer any of my questions about it, but I did get enough information from the Iowa Department of Management that I felt that I had enough to go on, that I published on Sunday. And none of these expenditures had been disclosed on any of the published databases of how the CARES Act was being spent. And the governor's office said later, after I published, they said, well, that's just because we haven't actually transferred the money, and when we transfer the money before September 30th, it'll show up. But I just wonder when, if ever, this spending would have been disclosed. I just stumbled onto it partly by luck.
They wish you would get unlucky, Laura. You are a thorn in the side of Governor Kim Reynolds, I got to tell you. Now, she's tap dancing around that a little bit, and to it was insult to injury as far as I'm concerned. You know where I'm at on this thing, and I talked about the fact that so many people are without jobs, so many people are without health care. I can get on my bicycle on a bike trail near where I live, and I can see people living in mobile homes with no windows in them. And I can ride 5 minutes and see people living in multi-million-dollar mansions, literally. These people, I want you, the visual image that I got when I read your article, I was thinking of a minimum wage single mother, or a single mother with no job on the phone fighting with a private insurer for Medicaid payments for a sick or disabled child. I mean, you think about somebody like that.
And I heard from a lot of people had the same reaction. I mean, I was hearing things like, well, our nursing home couldn't get the COVID test this spring, or somebody said he had a friend who was in the National Guard and they were trying to get PPE to some of the hospitals and they didn't have enough to go around. And so that's the kind of expense that you would hope that they would be spending CARES Act money on. And I want to be clear that as far as I've been able to uncover, no one on the governor's staff actually took home extra money. They didn't, I confirmed none of them were paid overtime. and none of them received raises during this period of March through June. But it's just that the federal money was used to cover part of their regular salary, and that should be covered out of the state budget. It really shouldn't be coming out of the federal budget unless the governor hired too many people at too high a salary and couldn't balance the books on her budget, which is which is originally why I even asked to look at these salary sharing agreements, because I was wondering whether something like that was going on.
Well, now that leads me to one of the questions that I had, because one of your earlier stories was about the Department of Health director getting this huge 45% increase or something in salary. Was this money used to cover any or part of that?
No, not that I know of. I haven't found of any CARES Act money being used. That was the state medical director, Dr. Caitlin Pedati. She's the leader of the epidemiology team at the Iowa Department of Public Health. And that was another example of where I was looking for something else, and then I found what was a bigger story. I was looking for information about overtime pay, and Dr. Pedati and some other senior staff at the Iowa Department of Public Health have been pulling in some very large amounts of overtime pay. But in the course of receiving those records, I realized that Dr. Pedati got a 45% raise when the new fiscal year started on July 1st, and this had not been disclosed anywhere. And usually in state government, if you look at salary records, almost everyone gets a little raise, a little bump at the start of the new fiscal year. That's just typical. And, it might be 1% or 1.5%, but I've never seen anyone get such a big raise like that 45%, particularly when, from my perspective, Iowa's not doing very well at managing the pandemic. I mean, I think objectively, it's hard to say that Dr. Pedati has really done a bang-up job on this.
Agreed. And, just to go back to my opener, I'm a bottom-up economics guy. I believe, like Robert Reich talks about it, you put the money in the hands of the people buy stuff from the top. They benefit, the people benefit. Instead, the CARES Act to me was the reverse of this. We gave a little bit of support at the bottom. We gave most of it the middle. And then here comes this money down to maybe to the middle, and we give it to state employees. I look at this and I think, my God, this is indefensible. Okay, the governor has a news conference this week and goes on the defense. Now, Laura, do you get to go to those news conferences? I know they blocked you, or they tried to block you from the State House. I mean, yeah.
I have been, the governor's communications director physically blocked me from entering the room at one of her press conferences in January. I am not allowed to attend her press conferences. And for most of the pandemic, they've been having a few reporters in the room, and then most of the reporters are on the phone line, and the governor's staff won't even give me the telephone number to call in. So I don't have any opportunity to ask the governor questions ever about anything. But, one of the issues the governor said at the press conference, she said the CARES Act funds can be used for salaries. And, that's yes, but not all salaries. I mean, so one of the key questions that she hasn't answered and her staff haven't answered, and I was trying to get answers to this even before I published my last post on Sunday, and I published an update on the situation this morning, Friday, but is under the CARES Act, if you take someone off their regular job and put them on something completely different that's related to the coronavirus pandemic, then you can use the CARES Act funds. And that makes a lot of sense, right? So if the governor, let's say I took as an example in my latest post, her legislative liaison, this is someone who handles communications between her office and state legislators. So if she put that person on something completely different, like let's say he's organizing getting PPE to hospitals, and that would be a substantially different job that's related to the pandemic. And then I could understand maybe using the CARES Act funds, but we don't know exactly what he was doing. If he was just communicating with legislators like he normally would, except they were talking about COVID-19, that's not doing a different job. And the governor's chief of staff, the governor's legal counsel, the governor's communications director, and a number of other people on her staff, to outside appearances, it looks like they're doing the same jobs they've always done. They might just be talking about coronavirus more, but it's not a substantially different use of the money if it's a job that was already accounted for in the budget. And her staff were accounted for in the budget. She didn't hire any new employees. I think if she had hired brand new staff to work on COVID-19, I think that probably would be an allowable expense under this. But, Kathy Abradovich of the Iowa Capitol Dispatch tried to ask about this, and then she tried a couple times to follow up, and they just cut her off. They didn't let her ask any more questions. So clearly, they're hoping that everybody in the press corps moves on from this issue now. But I'm certainly going to keep asking questions, and I hope other people will as well.
Well, good for you. I mean, and this is what it's all about. I mean, this is what the journalism is supposed to be about. It's an adversarial relationship. You're supposed to be after these people. It's not supposed to be cheerleading. I mean, people go to bleedingheartland.com and check this out, because you just posted. You don't get to go to the news conferences. You don't get to ask questions directly, but you've got some questions, and there are 5 there that are very important. And I don't know if you can run through the list or at least hit the highlights. What do you think needs to be answered by the governor, and through the smokescreen?
Well, I think the first thing is what I was just mentioning. We need to find out exactly what these 21 people on her staff have been doing, and were they actually substantially different from their regular job duties? Because if they weren't, then it's not an appropriate use of CARES Act funds. That's the biggest thing. The next question then is, what happened to this $2.3 million that the state legislator allocated for her staff? Did she spend through all of that on staff salaries, and then was she short of money and needed to get $450,000 of federal CARES Act funds, or what? Or did she somehow allocate part of that $2.3 million to some other use? That's something that several Democratic state lawmakers have questions about, because that's their oversight committees really should be looking into this. And a third question I have was specific to one of her staffers, a senior staffer who's very well paid, chief operating officer. And he's not on the list of people whose salaries were partly covered by the CARES Act, even though he definitely has been involved in these policy discussions. So I was wondering what's going on with that. And then I also wanted to know that they didn't answer any of my questions, but in communicating with David Pitt of the Associated Press, her chief of staff said that they confirmed with the U.S. Treasury's Office of Inspector General. And I have a lot more questions about that. Like, did they check with the Treasury's Inspector General before this decision was made, or was it more recent after I was already asking questions? And the fifth one that I think this is where it all began for me anyway, is the governor's office got $200,000 additional the last fiscal year. This is money that the Iowa legislature allocated in 2018. And they said they were going to spend it on 2 staff covering health and tax policy. And we now know from these salary sharing agreements that other state agencies were picking up the tab on those salaries. So why did they mislead the legislature about what they needed that $200,000 for? And it might sound like a small amount of money, but I think it's very important to hold these people accountable, because the legislature is supposed to be able to rely on information they get from the governor's office.
Well, I'm going to put some of that list up on the screen, and I want to put the column up there, the blog, so that people can see it. Again, encourage people to go on there, become a Patreon. I mean, this is real journalism, folks. I mean, and I got to give it to you, Laura. You're very objective, and that's because you're a working, practicing journalist, and that's one of the reasons people can trust you. I'm not. I kind of was back in the day, but I'm more of a partisan at this point. And the way that I look at this, I tell people all the time, reminds me of the famous line from the movie Casino with Robert De Niro: either they're too dumb or they're in on it. And on this particular issue, and just on your dealings with the governor's office and the legislatures and all this stuff, Laura, are you even willing to say which side of that you're on? Are they too dumb, or are they in on it?
Well, I think in some ways, certainly on this $200,000, they definitely weren't straight with the legislature. I think they were deceptive in why they were asking for that extra money. Now, it could be that they really believe that this is an appropriate use of the CARES Act. I don't know. I mean, it's hard for me to judge without knowing more specifics about what all these staff were doing. But I do know that when they don't answer any questions, and they tried to stop Kathy Abradovich from following up, it looked to me like they just don't want people digging further into this issue. I mean, I don't know. In general, I've found that I can't always rely on information I get from the governor's office, and I wish that weren't the case, but it is the case.
Now, me too. And we're out of time. And again, I just encourage people to check you out online. And and I'll say in closing to my audience, to people that listen to me now, as you drive around and you see your favorite small businesses closing up, you see for sale signs in your neighbor's yard, this pandemic is not over with. It's going to get worse. It's going to be very difficult to get additional aid to Americans, because the Congress, with the CARES Act, gave the Republicans, I hate to say it, folks, they gave them everything they wanted, gave them their whole wish list. They got their money. The stock market is booming. The major corporations are doing great. The people at the bottom are not, and they're going to do worse. And when that happens, when you see this looking around the landscape, think about Laura Belin's reporting and think about CARES Act money going to state employees. Honest to God. What a story. Laura, thanks for coming on A Podcast by George.
Thanks for having me, George.
We'll be back again soon, man. Keep up the good work. That is indeed another bombshell, another blockbuster from Bleeding Heartland. And folks, if you like this, if you like Podcast by George, if you like this independent journalism that we feature on here all the time, you can subscribe to us on YouTube, follow us on Facebook, get us on iTunes and Spotify and all those places where podcasts are seen or heard. But that's going to do it for today. As I say, that's all there is, and there ain't no more. That's another podcast by George.